Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pete Crane, the Vice President of Education and Access here at the National WWII Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the National WWII Museum's commemorative program for Yom HaShoah, sponsored by the Mark Rubin Family Endowment for Holocaust Education. I'd like to begin tonight's program by recognizing any Holocaust survivors and family members of Holocaust survivors in attendance tonight. Thank you for being here. Please stand or wave to be recognized. Tonight at sundown in Yad Vashem in Israel, 6 torches were lit to symbolize the approximately 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. In a new tradition for our commemoration, we've lit 6 candles representing the 6 million who were murdered. Each survivor or family member with us tonight also has a candle at their seat. And in a moment, I'm going to ask them to place their candles alongside the 6 on the stage, adding their light against the darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as the survivors and family members place their candles and remain standing as we mark a moment of silence. Thank you. Please be seated. To continue tonight's program, please join me in welcoming the National WWII Museum's President and CEO, Stephen Watson.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you to each of you for joining us as we commemorate Yom HaShoah. As Pete said, and as I think all of you know, Yom HaShoah is the day that we remember those who were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, and we honor their heroism, the heroism of survivors, the resistance fighters, and the liberators. And of course, here at America's National WWII Museum, we know that now, more than ever, it is vital that we share the experiences of those who survived the Holocaust and remember those who perished. In the face of disturbing rise in anti-Semitism and the voices of those who, despite all evidence to the contrary, would deny that this tragedy occurred, I think our focus needs to be sharper than ever. But we don't have to do this work alone. As you heard from Pete, we're privileged to have strong partners who support this work. And of course, tonight's program, which is presented by the Mark Rubin Family Endowment for Holocaust Programs, and I'll have more to say about Mark and his family in just a moment. Not only have they made this program tonight possible, but for years to come, our Yom HaShoah programming will be sponsored by their family endowment, and we are indebted to Karen, Pam, who I will have much to say about in a moment, for their support of the museum. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, Pam. And you know, just a great example of the tremendous network of supporters and partners that we have for all of our programs at the museum. I want to recognize a couple of additional important folks here tonight. That's Robert Priddy and his wife Kiki, and Sandy Villery, who along with Karen are trustees of the museum. So thank you, gentlemen, for your leadership as trustees and for being with us on this important day. So just a few words about Mark Rubin. For those of you who do not know, Mark Rubin was a longtime museum trustee and Holocaust survivor who was personally committed to ensuring that future generations would never forget the lessons of the Holocaust and World War II. And I can say, because I've talked to him about this several times, he was very proud to serve on the board of this museum. He was very proud to be the only Holocaust survivor that served on the board of our museum. And he was also very proud of his involvement in the development of our upcoming Liberation Pavilion. Mark, along with his wife, Pam, generously named the pavilion's first floor Liberation Theater, which will share the stories of both Holocaust survivors and liberators, so that our museum visitors will get a firsthand, very emotional, personal account of what it felt like to be a survivor at the moment you knew you were liberated and you were free. Incredibly powerful testimony. And you'll also hear from liberators about the horror they saw when they came upon a camp. And this will just be one of several exhibits in Liberation that will really bring forth all of the atrocities that the Holocaust was. So this was something that I know was personally incredibly important to Mark and Pam, and although Pam can't be here with us in person tonight, I know that she is watching from home. So Pam, I want to thank you for your friendship, for your generosity and support of the museum throughout all of these years. You and Mark have been a vital part of the growth and development of our museum, and we simply just can't thank you enough, and look forward to seeing you in November when we open the Liberation Pavilion. And on that note, we will open Liberation Pavilion this fall. You can see the building on our campus from the outside. It looks like it's finished. I promise you, if you open the doors, you will see that it's not, but it will be. But this is going to become a really, I think, very important part of the visitation experience at the National World War II Museum. We talk about our mission really in 3 chapters. You know, why did we fight the war? How did we go about winning it? And what does that mean today? And why should that matter almost 80 years after the fighting was over? And the Liberation Pavilion will bring that last chapter of our mission to life. It will, of course, have exhibits on the Holocaust, the cost of our war and the tragedy that it was, and help the visitor understand that when the fighting was over, what were the choices and decisions that were made to promote human rights, democracy, and freedom around the world, something that we will always have to be vigilant in protecting. So to me, what the Holocaust does, what the Liberation Pavilion does, is really help us understand the cost of the war and the meaning. And it's why I believe 1,000 years from now, we will continue to think of World War II as one of the seminal moments in human history. So that will open in November of this year. And although Mark will not be with us, he passed away on February 13th, 2021 at the age of 84, we know that this will be a permanent tribute to his life and all of those that were impacted by the Holocaust. But tonight we are privileged and honored to have a member of the Rubin family here with us, who you're going to hear from in just a moment, Karen Rubin, his daughter, who is right here. Karen, thank you again so much for being here to talk about your family's history and your father's story. Karen is the executive director of the Mosaic Law Congregation in Sacramento, California, after having held various leadership positions at the synagogue. In addition to her work with Mosaic Law, she is also a member of the Yom HaShoah Committee of the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento region, and a member of the Speakers Bureau supporting Sacramento's Holocaust Survivors and Descendants group. And I think we are just delighted that she is carrying on her family's legacy by serving as a trustee at the National World War II Museum. So in just a few moments, Karen will share more about her family's experience before, during, and after the Holocaust. But before she comes to the stage, we could think of no better way to start this portion of the program then by letting you hear directly from Mark Rubin. We are privileged to have his full oral history preserved in perpetuity as part of the museum's collection, one of more than 12,000 personal accounts. So with that, I ask that you direct your attention to the screen to hear from Mark Rubin. Thank you.
My memory goes back to when I was 2. Most of the memories growing up were not that good. So I try not to dwell on the bad parts of my youth as opposed to my good parts. I remember my grandparents my father's parents, being taken. I went to the train station to say goodbye to them. That was probably 1942. And I remember going to the train depot, saying goodbye to them. I knew then I would never see them again. They arrested my mother and my brother, myself. My father was not living with us at that time for the simple reason if we got caught, we all wouldn't be caught at the same time or caught at all. And so we wound up at the Gestapo headquarters, and first person we met was our father. He was caught the day before. My father bribed the Germans to send us there because he knew there was no gas chamber there at that time. I get very emotional when I think about that. It was a long trip, and I remember the odor in the car after the first day, and there were no facilities at all. There was one basin, and in an hour or two, the odor was just unbearable. From then on till we arrived in Terezin. It's not that far away from where we were. We were in a camp called Sered, which was like a transit camp, and it took days to get to Terezin. And we all couldn't lay down at the same time and sleep. So everybody took turns for a few hours laying down, and the other half of the people had to sit up to make room for the ones that were sleeping, then the reverse. And it was a long, long trip. Most of the people that went to Terezin, from there they went to Auschwitz, never to be seen again. We had rumors that the Russians were going to come and liberate us. So my brother and I went to the embankment because Terezin was a fort. At Maria Theresa's time, it was a fort. So there was an embankment. There was a flow, there was water in the old days when it was a real fort. We went to see the Germans retreat. So as they were retreating, they started shooting inside the camp. I could hear the bullets over my head. And my brother and I were laying on the embankment. I remember that vividly. And till they passed. And then we went back to the barrack where we lived with my mother. And I remember getting a spanking because she knew what happened, okay? It was after the fact. I didn't see the point of it, but nevertheless, I still remember the spanking. I give my father credit for keeping us alive till towards the end. till he caught the Gestapo person that caught us and him.
Your father apprehended the Gestapo agent
Yes,
who had arrested him
and us.
and the family.
Yes. And he went to the trial, and he went to the hanging, because we weren't the only ones. And then we left and went back to his business. We came in on the Queen Mary. I stopped being sick because our stateroom was at the lowest level you could get. And I got sick once we left Southampton, and I didn't stop getting sick till we found the breakwater in New York. And so I was standing on the deck. We passed the Statue of Liberty. Very emotional.
Would you like to go into any further?
No, I just think it's like, I think I mentioned it a few times. What I think about a lot is how lucky I am.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. This is the first time I'm giving his story since he's passed away, so please be patient. This PowerPoint presentation that is you'll hear tonight is a presentation I created as part of the Second Gen Speakers Bureau in Sacramento, and it's given to middle school students, particularly because they're learning about World War II, and by the time they get to the Holocaust section, it's the spring, and many, many, many students only know tangentially about what the Holocaust could have been, maybe. So myself and a whole host of other second gen and third gen people go into middle school classrooms for social studies and talk about our family history. You heard a little bit from my dad about his family's history, and you'll hear some more details tonight. So again, thank you very much for coming, and to Stephen and to Pete and everyone in the museum staff who made this event happen. The Holocaust was unique in that it is the only genocide documented by the perpetrators, acknowledged by the government and the country responsible for it, and remembered publicly by both its victims and perpetrators alike. Case in point, the Germans were very meticulous about documenting everything that happened everywhere. There's an archive facility in Bad Arolsen, Germany, that houses all of the documentation that the Nazi government produced. All of it. 16 miles of it. You can go online and look for it. I went on last night, and I found my grandfather's records in there. A tad disturbing, but there they were. Additionally, if you're in a European city, both in Eastern and Western Europe and in Russia, there's an art installation going on in about 1,200 different cities where a non-Jewish artist has created a project called the Stumbling Stones. What are those? Those are markers on the streets that denote what Jewish person lived there freely before they were taken away. There are 70,000 of those stones around Europe and Russia. Many people ask me why my father wasn't so vitriolic against Germans and why he thought what he did about them. And I can tell you unequivocally that his philosophy was, you can forgive, but you may never, ever forget. And that is why I'm here tonight, and why my mom and I wanted to do this in perpetuity so that people will learn what happened and ensure that it never happen again. My father never reflected. You heard him say, I remember. Those words never freely came out of his mouth, ever. He wasn't one to reminisce about the good old days, because as you heard, they really weren't so good for his childhood. He didn't have a childhood. It was horrific. and it should never be given to any child ever again. But I think his need for success in the United States came from an innate need for him to show the Nazis that he will work really hard to embrace the American dream, and through a lot of hard work, and as he said, a whole lot of luck, a lot of hard work, he fulfilled and embodied the American dream. He came here in steerage class with my uncle and my grandmother. My grandfather came 6 months later, didn't speak a word of English, and to the day he died, he never knew the English alphabet in its proper order, because I give him grief about that, but he embodied the American dream. My version of vengeance towards the Nazis is to educate you about what they tried to do and fortunately failed, and to ensure that everyone knows what they did to make sure it doesn't ever happen again. I owe it to my father, my uncle, my grandparents, cousins, my siblings, my children, my niece and nephew, to tell his story, because if I don't, who would? What my father did not say was, upon liberation, Terezin was known as the model concentration camp. Some of you may have heard that the Red Cross visited it, the encouragement of the Nazi government, to prove to the Red Cross that there was nothing bad happening in Germany or in the occupied countries. That was about 1.5 years before my dad and uncle and grandmother and grandfather got there. So they didn't get to witness the charade that was given to the Red Cross. What my dad did not say was that Terezin also has a stroke of notoriety against it. At its peak, there were 10,000 children running around in that camp, most of them with their parents, like my dad and my uncle, some teenagers who were kept in a separate building. The men were separated from their wives, but there were 10,000 children in that camp. At liberation, as my dad said, with the Germans shooting at him and my grandmother giving him a spanking, there were 104. My father, my uncle, and their 2 first cousins were 4 of the 104 children. It is a sheer miracle that he was there and liberated, because he has said that he was 3 days away from being deported. How did he know that? Because the Germans kept records and posted who was leaving when. This is his story. As I mentioned, the Holocaust is unique in that it was state-sponsored, it was systematic, of persecution and annihilation of not only European Jewry, but represented minorities, whether they be Roma, mentally disabled, Protestants, Baptists, didn't matter. As long, if you weren't what the Nazis wanted, you were on the list to be killed. It started in 1933, and it obviously ended at the war's conclusion in 1945. 6 million Jews, a total of 12 million people were murdered, not killed by being a soldier, murdered in World War II. My grandfather, Carl Rubin, he had 2 names, as did my grandmother, owned a lumber mill in a town called Prešov. It is now what is in the Slovakia. He had a non-Jewish business partner, whose name I just found out last week from Yad Vashem. His parents, my great-grandparents, Moshe Chaim Rubin and Gittel Rubin, lived in the same town as my dad and uncle. My great-grandfather was a salesman. And they had 2 children, my Aunt Sarah and my grandfather. And then my grandmother was one of 8. She had 1 sister and 6 brothers. And her parents, my great-grandfather, Yitzchak Meir Treitel, passed away in 1939. My great-grandmother, Necha, was sent to Auschwitz, survived Auschwitz, and died on the train ride home, and she's now buried in what is now Ukraine. You can see my dad and my uncle on the bottom, which is a similar picture that was shown. My dad has said that's the only time he was ever musical was when he had that in his hand. My grandmother was from a very small village called Kurima. My grandfather was born in a small village as well called Dubova. He lived in a big town called Bardiev. It was by horse. It was probably 45 minutes. By car, it's about 10 minutes. But they met and obviously married. My great-grandparents were very religious individuals. My great-grandfather was one of 5. The family tree was done. I think it's 55 pages. They're just kind of all over the place. But as I said, my grandmother was one of 2 girls, so a little bit of protexia by her older brothers. She was kind of in the middle in terms of who was older and who was younger. 4 of her brothers, her older brothers, migrated to the United States before 1940 and served in the American military. I don't know if they spoke English, but they served in the American military. They lived in New York. She and her sister and her 2 other brothers were still in Slovakia when the war broke out. Her sister was not married, nor was her other 2 brothers. We went back to the old country. In 1978, my brother had his bar mitzvah in Israel, and my parents made a thing. This is communist Czechoslovakia. That is the house where my grandmother was born in. At the time, it was the post office. You can see the roads are dirt. There were a lot of horse-drawn carriages. Cars weren't really a thing in 1978. But that's us standing in front of her house and where her father died. Not much to write home about, I must say. My grandparents got married in 1934. In Germany, Hitler was beginning to amass his legislation to ban Jews from doing most of anything. It had not yet spread to other countries, but they knew that there was something happening in Germany that needed to be watched. But nonetheless, they got married. Nuremberg laws created by the German government with the specific goal of eliminating Jewish life from German life. A series of laws that made it next to impossible to conduct business, to go to school, to hold a job, to be safe on the street. If you didn't have your card on you, you'd get beaten. Concentration camps had not yet started, but killings had. My father was born in 1937. This is the earliest known picture of him. My grandparents did quite well for themselves. My grandfather, as I said, had a non-Jewish business partner. He owned a lumber mill. He owned the land that the trees were forested on. The lumber became furniture, and he and his business partner did very well for themselves financially. There were housekeepers, there was a chauffeur, there were a quality of life that not everybody had, but my grandfather really enjoyed that quality of life. 1938, at this point, my father is about a year and a half old, and the Munich Agreement is a feeble attempt by Britain and France to appease Hitler. We all know it didn't work. In 1938, Czechoslovakia, my father and his family were living near a town. You can see, I don't know if you can see it very well, it's inside on the right side of the screen called Košice. That's not the town they were living in, but that's the biggest town near where they were. Close to the Hungarian border, close to the Polish border. Both my grandparents spoke 8 languages, English being one of the last ones to learn. My father, in his heyday, could have spoken 5, but as you get older, if you don't use it, you lose it. The annexation of the Sudetenland, according to my dad, when I asked him about it once, did not really make a big difference to the folks in the eastern side of the country. So they went about their lives and continued on as best they could. Obviously, it made a big difference to the people in Sudetenland and on the Czech side of the country, but it didn't seem to stop Hitler. Again, my dad being musical, take a look, never happens again. 1939, my father just turned 2, and the Germans have now decided that Czechoslovakia is next on their list of places to go. In an effort to try and assert some independence, the Slovakian government decided that they were going to be independent from what happened on the Czech side of the country, and they became a puppet state of Germany. But the Jews in the Slovakian side of the country were watching what was happening, but weren't directly impacted by it because Germany was too busy, particularly in Poland and in Austria, rounding up Jews. This is for lack of a better word, it's a county map of the Slovak side of the country. And my father and his family lived in the orange part. Saris is the region, akin to a county here. The town where my grandfather had his business was Prešov, which you could see is a larger blue dot. Size being relative in Eastern Europe, it's probably the size of a small village in Louisiana. But that's where he's from. You can see the town Sabinov up farther up a little bit. That is the town that both my uncle and my dad were born in. They were in a duplex. On the top floor was my great aunt and uncle and her kids, and on the bottom was my grandfather, my grandmother, and their 2 kids. It is a 2-road town, 1 road in and 1 road out. But my grandfather was very well connected. There was a chief rabbi, there was a chief of police, there was a well-established, entrenched Jewish community and non-Jewish community in the town. In 1940, things are heating up elsewhere in Europe, but they're trying to continue on with their lives in Slovakia. My father was not yet in school. I think my uncle had probably started kindergarten, and they tried to go to school. Tried. The Slovakian government decided that they needed to really show Hitler how well entrenched they were with the party line. So they decided they're going to round up Slovakian Jews beginning in 1942. You heard from my dad that he saw his grandparents go off to the train station. That was in the summer of 1942. They were sent to the Chelm ghetto in Poland, and they were subsequently taken out to a forest after about 3 weeks and shot. The Slovakian president decided that after he sent all those people to concentration camps, that he didn't need to send any more, but Hitler thought otherwise, so he didn't last much longer in his position. I believe that my great-grandmother was murdered first, and then a few days later, they sent out the men, and they shot them in the forest as well. No one knows exactly where the burial ground is, but the Germans recorded that they killed X number of people on X day at a location. And my grandfather deduced the day and the place. How did he deduce this? These are 2 postcards sent from Chelm to my great uncle, Edward Lowy. You can see it's in Sabinov. When I saw these, I said to my dad, they're not written by the same person. The handwriting is too different. But you may have heard that people were told that they were going to go to a relocation camp in the East, and that things were going to be okay, and they'll be able to write home, and that things are going to be great. These are those postcards that were sent home from the East. And it was basically, we're okay, Hope you're doing okay too. In 1944, there was a coup in Slovakia, and Germany didn't particularly take kindly to that. So as a source of punishment to the Slovakian government, they were forced to round up an additional 12,600 Jews and send them to various concentration camps or death camps. It was in these roundups that my father, uncle, grandmother, and grandfather were caught. What my dad did not say was how. He mentioned that my grandfather was separate from them on purpose so that if one didn't get caught, at least one would live. They had been taking turns. Sometimes my dad went to stay with my grandfather, sometimes my uncle went to stay with my grandfather, but they were never together. And my grandfather, because he had a non-Jewish business partner, the business was still operational and money was coming in. He was able to bribe individuals to keep my grandmother, my great aunt, my grandfather's sister and her family, and my grandfather, and obviously my dad and my uncle, in different apartments, and paying off the people so that they would not report them to the Gestapo. Because the business was still operational, he was able to spend a whole lot of money bribing a whole bunch of people to keep quiet, which was successful, except for the fact that the Gestapo knew that there were more Jews in the area. By this point, they were living in Bratislava, which was now the capital of Slovakia, which is a very large town. The Gestapo knew that there were Jews hiding. They just didn't know exactly where. So what did? They offer a bounty to anyone who can tell them where the Jews are. Well, it's wartime. People are hungry, I suppose. The daughter of the man who was hiding my dad, uncle, and grandmother, I think she was about 19 or 20, she reported them to the Gestapo to get money. And they knocked on the door, and my dad and my uncle had been taught to hide whenever someone knocks on the door, whatever time of day it is. And they hid underneath the bed. And my grandmother answered the door, and it was the Gestapo, and my dad and uncle are hiding underneath the bed, and the Gestapo agents pull him out from underneath the bed, and they ask him if they're Jewish, and they say, no, we're not, no, we're not, no, we're not, no, we're not. And they pulled their pants down to prove that they were Jewish, because uncircumcised males were not Jewish, and they were circumcised. They took all three individuals to Gestapo headquarters. My dad tried to jump out of the police car, so he didn't have to go to the headquarters. Obviously, that failed. And they beat my grandmother up for a good long time, wanting to know where my grandfather was. And my grandfather was in the next room, and they knew that. And they beat him up, too. He had a bad attitude throughout the war. I like to think I'd take after him on that front. They'd mandate that he do something, and he'd say no, and he'd get beaten up. They'd mandate he'd do something else, and he'd say no, and he'd get beaten up. Whether it was in Gestapo headquarters or it was in Terezin, he just had a bad attitude. But that's how my dad got caught. And whenever not that I did very often, when I would ask him about that woman, his face contorted. He got very quiet, and he said, I have nothing to say, and I will not say anything about her other than I hope she rots in hell. Before they got caught, life had to continue, according to my grandmother. This is a picture of my dad in kindergarten in a school play. There's a class picture that my mom has of that particular class. It's about 30 children. 29 of them are blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and there's this little boy in the end who's brown brown-haired and brown-eyed, and that would be my dad. Everyone else looked like everybody else, except for my dad. This picture on the left, that's obviously my dad sitting in front of my grandmother. I have no idea who those people are. But, you know, such a serious face by my dad. I don't even know where my uncle was at that point, but it seems that they were enjoying a Sunday out with some friends. And my dad, who you saw him in a coat and tie, wearing a coat. He was in his go-to attitude. But that was them during the war before they had to go into hiding. They had heard through the rumor mill that there were extermination camps in Poland, and my grandfather had the wherewithal to bribe the Nazi guard to redirect them when leaving Sered to not go to Auschwitz and send them to Terezin instead. Terezin, as my dad said, is a fort that is about a 30-minute drive to the northwest of Prague. They were coming from Bratislava by train that would probably take, on a normal World War II schedule, 4 hours. It took them 4 days in the train. We visited Terezin on that same trip in 1978 with my grandmother and my dad. The room right here on the bottom with the door closest to us, that was the actual room that they lived in, the three of them. It faced out to the outside, so not only did my dad and uncle get to see the front from the embankment, they could watch it from their window as well. The Germans kept children with their mother up until a certain age, so they hung out with my grandmother. My grandfather had different jobs at the camp. One of them was to work the crematoria, which they used to dispose of the deceased. My grandmother told me that when they first got to camp, they had to be deloused, and everybody was convinced that they were going to be gassed right then and there in the showers. And they were very surprised when the water came on. My grandfather's sole purpose at the camp was to provide additional food for my dad and uncle, so they would have to have more than just a piece of bread a day. Although my dad has said when they saw a dead horse coming in, they knew they were going to have meat that day. But they got one meal a day. My dad suffered from scurvy, rickets, beriberi. He had brittle bones as a child because he was starved and malnourished. And he was not alone. When you don't eat a regular meal, things happen to you as a child, and things happen to you as an adult. The Germans, in their intense need to have order and procedure, gave every prisoner ration cards and bank cards, so you could spend your money at nowhere to go. You can see it says Rubin, Thomas. My father changed his name during the war. He was born Maximilian. He changed it to Thomas because it sounded less Jewish. He actually worked for a time before they got caught. He worked as an altar boy in the Catholic Church. He was fascinated by when they would elect the new pope. He just thought that was the best thing ever, you know, with the little incense guys. He thought he knew all the Latin. I'm like, go ahead, sing it, Dad. And he's like, this is great, isn't it? What you see on the left side is his ration card for food. That's the assumption that you're going to get food. On the right side was his bank card. And again, you can see it's his name. If you open up on the inside of it, it has a 50 kroner. You have nowhere to go. Nothing to buy. Why go through that? But they issued him because they had to know where people were going to spend their money on. Theresienstadt was also known for having its own currency, only for Jews. You couldn't use it anywhere, but they had their own currency, and these are denominations that my grandfather took when he left the camp in 1945. He had since donated them to Yad Vashem in Israel. Again, worthless, but Jews had to use them. As my father said, the Russians liberated them in May. They were liberated after Berlin. The Germans still had control over this sector of Czechoslovakia, and they weren't giving it up so quickly. But when the Russians came barreling down the road, and the Germans realized that they kind of were on the wrong end of the stick on that one, they left. And the Russian colonel came into camp, and the 104 children that were left there kind of surrounded this guy parading around in a big horse, and he gave each child a piece of candy. It's the first candy my dad had had in about 6 years. And it was this big, tall, important man with lots of medals on his chest. And then the Russians came in and said, "You can leave." My grandfather decided they weren't going to leave just yet because they had to figure out where they were going to go, so they stayed in the camp a few more weeks until there was a typhus outbreak. And then my grandfather said, "We're out of here. We're going." They walked to Prague, which my dad said it took them about 2 days to walk to Prague. They had nowhere to go. They had no home, per se, but they walked. And my grandmother took 2 things with her from the camp: flour and sugar, so that she could at least make bread when they came upon some water, which she did. They got to Prague, and they decided that they were going to go to Bratislava, even though that wasn't their hometown. They were going to go to Bratislava, where my grandfather, who had no formal police training at all, joined the Bratislava police force as the detective in charge of finding the Gestapo agent, which he did. Then he went to the trial, and they convicted him, and they hung him, and then my grandfather quit the police force, and they went back to Prešov, where they tried to resume a, quote, normal life. What people don't seem to realize is the anti-Semitism that was inbred in the society before the war was still there. They're still calling my dad the dirty Jew. They're still harassing him and bullying him at school with him and his brother. The anti-Semitism didn't go away just because Hitler did. It was still there, and it probably is still there today. But my grandmother realized that this was not the right place for them. Her brothers were already in the United States for the most part. She had 2 still in Czechoslovakia, and they needed to make a change. Conveniently, here come the communists. And my grandfather still had a non-Jewish business partner. The communists were taking over everyone's business. They took over my grandfather's. Unfortunately for my grandfather, he was also in a major car crash and was bedridden for a great deal of time. During that period of time, my grandmother and dad and uncle got visas to come to the United States. So they left my grandfather in Prešov and made their way to Paris, made their way to Southampton, where my dad and uncle and grandmother got on the Queen Mary and came to the United States, not speaking a word of English, not knowing what the culture was like, and needing to find somewhere to live in a hurry. She was there by herself for a full 6 months. Her sisters-in-law, who were born in America, most of them, offered her no help. They rented an apartment in the Bronx. My grandmother, for a very, very, very long time, carried around a little teeny-weeny English-Slovak dictionary, like you could put in your pocket. When she didn't know the word, she'd look it up in this little teeny-weeny dictionary. And when my sister was cleaning out my dad's desk after he passed away, that dictionary was in his drawer. This is them after the war. I said to my dad a number of years ago, I said, you know, I grew up going to an Orthodox Jewish day school, and they talk about the Holocaust in the sense of you're one generation away. It could have been you. Not too much guilt there. And I said to my dad, I always got the impression that the sun never came out during World War II. That it was just so gloomy and morose and horrible. And he looked at me and he goes, "What are you, nuts?" Of course the sun came out. The sun came out. My uncle was a year and a half older than my dad, but they didn't ever speak about what happened to them during the war. In 1948, the family moves to New York. My grandfather joined them 6 months later. And my dad and my uncle start school in kindergarten to learn English. And then when they became more proficient, they moved him up a grade as quickly as they could, so that he was grade age appropriate by the time he started school in 1949. My grandfather came out, and they managed to eke out a living. And my dad and my uncle both had their bar mitzvahs in New York in Yiddish, a language they did not speak at home, but his speech was in Yiddish, which he had to learn in New York. And my grandfather decided in 1953, he got into a car, drove across the country to Los Angeles, called my grandmother and said, "Come." So they did. They moved to Los Angeles in 1953. My dad graduated high school in 1955, and he joined the U.S. Army. He thought it'd be fun. He was stationed in Fort Ord, outside of Monterey in California. I said, "What'd you do in the Army, Dad?" "I learned how to make knots, and I drove a truck." "Where'd you drive your truck to?" "Washington State, every weekend, up and back down I-5. I said, "And then what?" He goes, "Then I got a desk job, and I looked and see how I can get myself an honorable discharge." And that's exactly what I did. So that was a one-year gig. 1958, 59, he wants to go to college, but he can't because he has to support his family. He starts working as an apprentice to be a window glazier. What did he know about windows? But people were building a bunch of stuff in LA. San Fernando Valley was exploding with construction. People needed windows and doors. So he started with my uncle and my grandfather, a company to be a window glazier. 1962, he meets and marries my mom at his wedding. My uncle got married in 1961. And in 1973, in that picture, my grandparents left Los Angeles, much to the dismay of my grandmother, and made Aliyah to Israel, where my grandfather's sister had left and moved to in 1948. They stayed there for less than 3 years. They moved back to California in 1975, and my grandfather died in 1975. My uncle passed away in 2001 from heart disease and the effects of being starved and malnourished as a child. Big party. My mom likes to throw big parties. The two men in the back are my children, Aaron and Evan. Evan is named after my grandmother, Eva. The two small people in the front are my brother's twins, Brock and Eva. My sister's in the black, and my brother is in the other side with my red tie next to his ex-wife. And then there's me in the red. So everyone is a little bit taller now, except for my mom and myself. The twins are having their bar bat mitzvah this summer, and he is sorely missed. He, for those of you who don't know him or didn't have the privilege of ever meeting him, he transitioned, or as they say in today's cultural lingo, he pivoted from being a window glazier to realizing that subcontractors don't make nearly as much money, it's not nearly as lucrative as being the general contractor. So he and my uncle became general contractors. Not that they knew what they had to do for that, but they became general contractors. And they started building apartment houses in various parts of Los Angeles. Because if you build an apartment and then people rent the apartment, then you get rent money from those apartments. Over the course of the years, he became a very successful real estate developer, at one point being the largest private landowner in the county of Riverside after the federal government. To this day, the company that he started and was partnered with his first cousin who was in the camp with him, Alex, is still operational. My sister is the CEO. My brother is one of the VPs. And they just opened a brand new 167-unit mixed-use apartment building in the city of Riverside named The Mark. One last thing. My father never spoke about the war. He never spoke about the atrocities he saw or what they had to witness or what they experienced. He always believed in looking forward, in looking to see what opportunities await you, and to never look back unless it was for a historical lesson. I truly hope that as these events happen year over year in his memory, that you remember that these things happened and they can never, ever happen again. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much for sharing your family with us. We're forever grateful to have had your father as part of this museum. At this time, I'd like to ask Rabbi David Gerber to come to the stage and lead us through traditional prayers of Yom HaShoah.
Yom HaShoah is a day for remembrance. It's a day to honor those that have been taken from us. It's a day of hope. You can't help but noticing these smiling faces as the backdrop for these candles of memory. And while at the time we think about how many lights were extinguished, we're reminded that it takes just a single flame shared with another to expand its own. And you can only imagine how much light exists in the world because of your family, Karen, and thank you for sharing that with us. There are several traditional prayers read, chanted on Yom HaShoah, and they both have a similar message. The first is a prayer called El Malei Rachamim, and it's a prayer we say when we lose somebody. It's a prayer for the soul of the person we have lost, and in this case, we recite it for all the souls who have people to say their names and people who have no one to say their names. The second prayer is called Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. And this is a prayer, really a prayer for what we call Yizkor, for memory, recognizing that all life is given to us by God, and through our lives, we honor God who gives it. As we begin with El Malei Rachamim, I'll invite everybody, if they're able, to please rise. And just so you know, the languages you're about to hear, the first one is in Hebrew and the second one is in Aramaic. I'll translate. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein B'Amromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, Im Kedoshim Otohorim, Kizohar Harakia Mazirim, Let Nishmot Yakirenu Shalchu Le'olamam, Baal Harachamim Yastireim Beseter Kenafav Le'olamim. Vaitzor b'tzrachayim et nishmatam. Adonai hu nachalatam. V'yanuchu b'shalom al mishkavam. V'nomar. Amen. God of abundant mercy, God most high, may the souls of our loved ones who have entered into eternity find the gift of perfect rest in your presence. Together with the holy and pure whose light shines like the radiance of heaven. Compassionate God, hold them close to you forever, so that their soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. May they find a home with you. May they rest in peace, as together we say, Amen. May the love and eternal connection of our souls give us strength as we turn to recite the words hallowed by time. Sanctifying the name of God, we honor the memory of those taken from us in the Shoah. Yitgadal v'kadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divrachu tev yamlich malchuteh, b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kariv v'nomar, Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'almei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, V'tadar v'talei v'talal shmei d'kudashah b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Damiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Osei shalom bimromav. Hu ya'asei shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Exalted and hallowed be God's name in the world which God created according to plan. May God's majesty be revealed in the days of our lifetime and the life of all Israel. Speedily, imminently, to which we say, Amen. Blessed be God's great name to all eternity. Blessed, praised, honored, exalted, extolled, glorified, adored, and lauded the name of the Holy Blessed One. Beyond all earthly words and songs of blessing, praise and comfort to which we say, Amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and all Israel, to which we say, Amen. May the source of God send peace and comfort to all who mourn, as together we say, Amen. Please be seated.
Thank you, Rabbi Gerber. The inclusion of these prayers in tonight's program is the beginning of an annual tradition for the National WWII Museum, as we remember those who were lost in the Holocaust, its survivors, and their family members. Again, I'd like to thank Karen and the Rubin family for their generosity in supporting programs like this that help educate the future generations about the Holocaust and to build understanding and help prevent the repetition of that dark part of our world history. Thank you again to each of you joining us tonight, whether online or here in person in New Orleans, as we take care. And I look forward to seeing all of you again here soon at the National WWII Museum. Thank you for coming.